Hi everyone, I'm Nikki, sewing blogger at sewuprising.com and grateful participant in FEE Swim Week 2018. This morning on the FEE blog I had talked all about changing lingerie sewing patterns into swimwear sewing patterns. There's a good amount of math involved in adjusting seam allowances, so I wanted to come on quick and explain that math to you, walk through it with you a little bit, in case you have some trouble following how I wrote it on the blog. There's a lot more information about changing the patterns and adjustments that should be made when switching from lingerie to swimwear on the blog, so make sure you check that out before you start sewing. So most lingerie sewing patterns call for something called picot elastic, which looks like this. It comes in a couple different forms, just a plain regular elastic version and then a plush back elastic version. Great for lingerie sewing, not so great for swimwear sewing. It doesn't really hold up well to salt or chlorine or anything like that. So when you're adjusting your lingerie patterns to be swimwear patterns, one of the big things you have to do is make sure you're taking out the picot elastic and swapping it out for something like swim-specific elastic or fold-over elastic. So swim-specific elastic looks like this. It's more of a natural tan color. Comes in a couple different widths, much cheaper if you bulk order from Amazon. And then fold-over elastic looks like this. This is just a little sample piece I have here. But it folds directly in the middle, folds in on itself, and encases the edge of the fabric to give it a nice clean finish. Both of these are going to hold up a lot better to salt and chlorine than the picot elastic. However, this is going to be your best bet if you're a really heavy swimmer. Most of my swimsuits do a lot more time hanging out next to the pool than in the pool, so I tend to go for fold-over elastic because I like the look of it. And I'm not too concerned about the swimsuit breaking down because, I mean, it's not in the water very often, if we're being honest. But this will hold up better over time than picot elastic. So, the trick is, picot elastic comes in many different widths. Swimsuit and fold-over elastic, not so much. So we need to make sure we are adjusting the seam allowances in our patterns to fit this elastic instead of this elastic.
Alright, so the first situation we have is if your pattern calls for a 1/2 inch picot elastic and you have 1/2 inch swim elastic. The great situation here is you actually do not have to do any adjusting to your seam allowances. The way swim elastic is sewn, it is folded in on itself the same way picot elastic is, so you don't need to adjust your seam allowances at all. If you need some help attaching your swimwear elastic, there's actually already been a sew-along video done about attaching swimwear elastic as part of Swim Week, so be sure to check that out. There's a link in the blog. The next situation is if your pattern calls for 1/2 inch picot elastic, but you only have 1/4 inch fold-over elastic. In this situation, you're going to need to remove the difference between these two twice. So, ready for some fractions? Right? Times 2 is going to give you a total of a 1/2 inch that you need to remove from your seam allowance. Now, you're only removing this from the seam allowances that the elastic is going to be placed on. Make sure you're not adjusting the seam allowances where the suit pieces actually get attached to each other, but only around like the leg openings, the waist openings, in places like that where the elastic is going to be actually attached. But in this situation, you're going to remove a 1/2 inch of seam allowance from those places. Alright, so this next version is if your pattern calls for 1/2 inch picot elastic and you have 1/2 inch fold over elastic. So 1/2 inch fold over elastic doesn't get turned under like swimwear elastic or picot elastic does. So in this situation, you only need to remove half of what your original seam allowance is. So with a 1/2 inch picot elastic, you have an inch of seam allowance there. So you're just going to need to remove 1/2 inch, clear it out there, to make sure your pattern fits the way it's intended. Alright, now this one, our last example, is a little more complicated. And this is if your pattern calls for a 1/2 inch picot elastic, but you have 3/8 inch swim elastic, which is the most common width of swim elastic that at least I have been able to find. So, remember for swim and picot elastic, the elastic gets turned under to the inside of the swimsuit, so you need the double the seam allowances, but you need to remove the 3/8 from the 1/2. So, 1/2 minus 3/8 is going to give you 1/8, right, or 0.125 inches if you are using a quilting ruler, which is going to make removing your seam allowances that much quicker. But since you are doing the fold over version with swim elastic, you actually need to times that by 2. So 1/8 times 2 is going to be 1/4 inch that you are going to remove again from the places in the pattern where elastic is going to be applied to your swimsuit.
Alright, and that's all there is to it. As you can see, it's pretty simple math, but it is really important math to make sure you're getting the proper and intended fit for your swimwear designs. If you have any questions or need any help in your specific situation, feel free to comment below and I can work through the math with you. Or if you want a written breakdown of how to do all of this and more tips on turning lingerie patterns into swimwear, be sure to visit VFabric's blog. And happy sewing!